Hey guys, this is Benjamin Alley again. Welcome to our first history snippet, the 6 major geographical moves of the Old Testament. Have you ever had to move to a new place? What's it like? How does it feel? Oftentimes moving from one place to another is challenging. In fact, it often creates a lot of, quote, moving stress. During their 4,000 plus year history, the people of the Old Testament made 6 geographical moves. Each of these moves created some level of moving stress for these people. These moving experiences challenged their faith and their trust in the God of the Old Testament. Through learning these geographical moves in sequence, why each move was made, the circumstances surrounding it, and how each move fits into God's overall plan, one can understand the Old Testament from beginning to end. Now, as we study these geographical moves, I want you to ask yourself this question. What can I learn about God's character from this move? Now, why do I want you to ask yourself this question? Because you might also be going through a moving phase in your life. You might be moving from one geographic place to another, just like the Israelites. Or you might be moving from school to the working world with your first job. Or you might be moving from being single to being married. Or you might be growing older. Or you might be moving from having a family with no children to many children. Or you might be moving from one job to another. Or any other number of moves. Each of these moves might bring a certain level of, quote, moving stress to your life. However, the God of the Old Testament has not changed. He is the same God who walked with the people of the Old Testament as they faced the stress of their moves. And by looking at how He interacts with and cares for the people of the Old Testament, we can gain a new level of insight into how God cares for us and how He can respond to our present moving situation. As we look at these 6 geographical moves, I want you to find one insight into God's character to help you manage the stress of your current move. So, let's begin. So we start with a basic timeline of the Old Testament. This timeline that's before you is just meant to provide us with a starting point for our study of the history of the Old Testament. So generally, you can place the stories of Abraham around 2000 BC. And then you can place the stories of Moses around 1500 BC, the stories of David around 1000 BC, and then the exile period, or the time when the Israelites were taken into slavery in Babylon, around 500 BC. Now these dates are by no means exact, and some of them are actually hotly debated among scholars. But we are not concerned about those details. We are just trying to find a starting point. We will come back to this timeline each week as we add more and more items to our timeline. So we'll actually begin to build layers. Now, let's turn to the 6 major geographical moves of the Old Testament. The first major geographic move of the Old Testament is Eden to Ur. Now, as I mentioned in the Geography Snippet 1, there are at least 3 different theories as to where Eden was actually located. We don't really know where Eden was located, so I've just picked one of the places close to the Persian Gulf as the starting point. So the move begins with creation in the Garden of Eden at the beginning of the Old Testament. After Adam and Eve sinned, God drove them out of the beautiful garden that He had prepared for them. Genesis 3:24 says that God placed them on the east side of the garden. Now this word in Hebrew, the word east, can also mean front. So according to Genesis 3:24, God could have placed them at the front of the garden or the east of the garden. After Adam and Eve, the Bible describes the population of mankind becoming greater and greater. Genesis 6 speaks of man's wickedness also becoming worse and worse. And the Lord was grieved, and His heart was filled with pain. God makes a decision to wipe out mankind, but one man, Noah, found favor in the eyes of the Lord. God told Noah to build an ark. Noah obeyed the Lord and built the ark. Now I'm sure Noah's neighbors thought he was crazy for building a big boat in his backyard. Nevertheless, he obeyed God even though it did not make sense. Then the flood waters came. After the flood, the Bible describes that the ark landed on the mountains of Ararat. Now this completes the first half of the journey, Eden to Mount Ararat. Noah's sons left the ark and migrated to different regions in the ancient Near East. One of Noah's sons, a guy named Shem, and his descendants came to occupy the region in the circle on your map. Now one of the descendants of Shem was a man named Abram. Abram came to be known as Abraham. Abraham lived in a place called Ur. And with this arrival of Abraham in Ur, that continues the second half of our move from Ararat to Ur. So this completes the entire move, number 1, Eden to Ur. Now what have you learned about God's character from this move? Let's take a moment to talk about that. One character trait that we can see is that God is a holy God who cannot stand sin. We see this in the fact that God expelled Adam and Eve from the garden. But we also see that this God is one who rescues people who trust and obey Him, just as He saved Noah and his family. So, are you in the midst of a move because of the bad choices that you've made? Has life gotten so bad that you think maybe it could not get any worse? Well, God is a God who can start something new in your life if you choose to obey Him. So the question is, will you begin to obey Him? What other insights can you see into this geographical move? Moving on, our second major geographical move of the Old Testament is Ur to Israel. We pick up where we left off with Abram and Ur. God spoke to Abram and told him to leave that country and his father's household and to go to the land He would show him. Through Abram, all the peoples of the earth would be blessed. Now this was definitely a challenging call for Abram to obey. It was a call to leave everything he knew and where he was comfortable and to put himself in a situation where he did not know anything. A situation where he would have to trust God. Yet if he would obey this God, blessing would follow not only for Abraham, but for others as well. The scriptures describe Abram as going first to the city of Haran. There he waited for his father to die. Then Abram continued to land called Canaan, the land that would soon be called Israel. Once Abram reaches Canaan, the second major move is finished, Ur to Israel. Now what have you learned about God's character or God's nature from this geographical move? One character quality we see is God sometimes challenges us. He challenged Abram to go to a land which he had never seen before and where he would be a foreigner. As Abram trusted in God, God not only blessed him, but used Abram to bless others. Now moving to a new place or into a new phase of life can create challenges that sometimes we feel are beyond our strength and ability. Yet God is one who will bless us as we trust Him. And He can use us in our weakness to bless others. So are you willing to depend upon God in the midst of your present move so that He can use you to be a blessing to others? What other insights do you find in this geographical move? Moving on once again, the third geographical move of the Old Testament was Israel to Egypt. Now we pick up where we left off with Abraham living in the land of Israel. Now Abraham lived in this land as a foreigner for several years. Eventually Abraham has a son named Isaac, and Isaac has two boys named Jacob and Esau. Now Jacob is the one that's important for our purposes. Jacob's name was eventually changed to Israel. Now Jacob had 12 sons, and the descendants of those 12 sons became the 12 tribes of Israel. Now one of Jacob's sons, one of those 12 sons was named Joseph. Many bad things happened to Joseph. First, his brothers were incredibly jealous of Joseph because of how Jacob, his father, loved him. Eventually, the brothers could not take it anymore, and they sold Joseph into slavery to a caravan of traders that was passing through the territory. The traders take Joseph to Egypt. Now in Egypt, the traders sold Joseph to an Egyptian official named Potiphar. And Joseph had success in managing Potiphar's house, but unfortunately, Potiphar's wife took an unhealthy interest in Joseph. Now Joseph continually resisted her sexual advances, but eventually Potiphar's wife falsely accused Joseph of attacking her. As a result, Joseph was thrown into prison. In prison, Joseph interpreted the dreams of two of Pharaoh's officials who fell out of favor with Pharaoh and had ended up in jail themselves. One of the officials was restored to his position, while the other was put to death. Joseph, however, was forgotten in prison for 2 years. But then Pharaoh has a dream that greatly disturbs him. The official that had been in prison with Joseph remembers, hey, there's this guy named Joseph who interpreted my dream in prison. Pharaoh calls Joseph up from prison, and Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. And Pharaoh is so pleased that Pharaoh makes Joseph second in command in Egypt. A famine comes to the land, but Egypt has stored up grain because of the good management of Joseph, who was second in command. Joseph's brothers come to Egypt from Canaan, seeking food. Eventually, Joseph reveals himself to his brothers, and they are terrified, well, because they sold him into slavery. And now he is so powerful in Egypt. Yet, Joseph doesn't respond in anger to his brothers, but rather with forgiveness. Joseph says that it was not the brothers who sent him to Egypt, but God sent him there. God allowed all of the bad things to happen to him because God had greater plans for Joseph and also for God's people. So Joseph brings his entire family to live in Egypt. And so this third move from Israel to Egypt is complete. Now let's take a moment once again and ask, what have you learned about God's character from this geographical move? Well, one thing we can see is that God is one who can make good out of bad. So many bad things happened to Joseph, but God had a greater plan. In fact, sometimes God even allowed bad things in Joseph's life in order that he might accomplish a greater purpose. So in the move that you are facing right now, do you believe that God can really bring good out of bad? Do you believe that God has a greater plan for you despite the stress you are currently facing? Are you willing to trust God even though you can't see the big picture? What other insights do you see from this passage? And what other insights do you see from this geographical move?